Hello again, and welcome back. Um, Today's video is going to be an adventure in reading. Um, uh, those of you who've watched a few of these videos will know that, of course, I'm always on the hunt for good books, particularly good books that I can donate to my very favorite bookstore, the Hatter Bookshop. And a recurring theme in that hunt are the works of Erik Larson. And I had a question in my comments about Erik Larson's writing, why I think it's good, why I'm always on the lookout for it, and why if I see it out in the world wild, I'm going to bring it in. Um, uh, I've held multiple titles and multiple copies of each of those titles, it seems. But anyway, in any event, I just want to talk for a few minutes about Erik Larson and about the genre he writes in. Erik Larson is an American writer, journalist. In fact, he's been writing for a while. I think his first book was in 1992. In that era, he was writing for major news magazines. I believe he's written for instance, The New Yorker, um, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, uh, major publications. And early on, sort of mainstream journalistic reporting. And in fact, his first two books were what I would call more journalism than anything else. I have a few notes just to keep me honest. Erik Larson's written 10 books. The first two are what I would call just straight journalism. The first in 1992 was called The Naked Consumer. And it was a book I've not read. I just know about from just doing a little research and reading the blurbs. And I've seen Erik Larson give several presentations, um, both on YouTube and actually on C-SPAN. Um, and he talked a little about those early works. But that first book, The Naked Consumer, is about consumerism in America, about marketing, about consumer privacy, how it's exploited. Um, and my goodness, I'm sure that has changed much since 1992. Um, before, and in the days really before the internet or cell phones. The second book he wrote was a couple years later. He wrote a book called The Lethal Passage, which was about kind of the biography of an illegal firearm, as I recall. Like I say, it's one I have not read and actually have never found. Um, but it's a book about gun crime, gun violence, debates over gun control, that sort of thing. And those were his first two outings, and they met with some success. But he really found his niche with his third book, which I actually have. Um, Starting with his third book and coming down to the present day, with one exception, Erik Larson has written in a genre that I would call narrative history or popular history. He and others have described his style of writing as history that reads like a novel. On more than one occasion, he said that his goal is to take historical events, write about them in prose, kind of like telling the story like a novel, to draw you back to a specific era in history, uh, to transport you to that world, so you can vicariously live through it. Um, and I think he succeeds in that very well. So without further ado, let's go through some of the books that I have read or at least own. The first one, this is his first foray into narrative history. Isaac Storm, uh, A Man, a Time, and the Deadliest Hurricane in History. This is a book about Isaac Klein, who worked for the U.S. Weather Bureau, the forerunner of the National Weather Service. And he was stationed in Galveston, Texas. Um, and the book centers around the events of the massive hurricane that destroyed Galveston on September 8th, 1900. And I suppose this is Mr. Klein right here, Isaac Klein of Isaac Storm fame. Um, and basically, through through Isaac Klein's reports, telegrams he wrote, records he kept, you kind of uncover the story of this hurricane, why it was so devastating, and how it became one of the greatest or most lethal natural disasters in American history. Over 8,000 people killed in the immediate aftermath, during the hurricane or in its immediate aftermath. Um, and, Isaac Klein's role in it is kind of a mixed bag. Um, Isaac Klein, with the rudimentary observational equipment they had, in the year 1900, over 125 years, going on 125 years ago, um, he predicted that this hurricane that was going across Cuba was indeed going to head to Texas and strike somewhere on the Texas coast, um, and actually disobeyed orders to issue a hurricane warning to that populace. And in the aftermath of that hurricane, he was hailed as a hero. His efforts to warn the local population undoubtedly saved thousands of lives, even though thousands more were lost. Uh, but um, but but also it's a very human story and a tragic story because uh, prior to that event, Isaac Klein lobbied hard uh, to not make some necessary preparations that could have saved Galveston, saved it a lot of its damage, because he at the time did not believe that a strong hurricane was ever going to land in that area of Texas, that it was so statistically unlikely that they shouldn't take some precautions against it. So he lobbied against flood walls and against some other preventative things that could have helped the city. And of course, Galveston at the time was like the city on the Texas coast. And after the hurricane, it was fairly quickly eclipsed by nearby Houston. And of course, Houston's one of the largest cities in America today. But an interesting story, it's and Larson sets a style with this one, and we'll talk a little bit about it here. Uh, but he of course has an extensive bibliography in the back, just like any other historical work, and extensive notes, page by page, chapter by chapter. Okay. And you will find none of that in the main text. The main text reads very much like a novel. There are no footnotes. Um, there are, nothing to distract you from the story. You can read it just as if it was a work of fiction. And if you want to know more about it, or where he's getting the facts that this narrative in this prose is based on, you can just flip back to the back and he'll give you his sources. And actually, a lot of times, some more interesting information that if you put it in the middle of the book might slow down the story. Um, in Larson's books, you will find quotations as if it's dialogue in a novel. And Larson's basically his position is that if you see a quote in one of his books as if it's dialogue, it's based on a letter, or a telegram, or a court transcript, or some other piece of documentation. And it'll be referred to in the back in the notes for that page. Because once again, he wants you to experience history very viscerally as if you were part of it. Anyway, that's the first one, Isaac Storm, one I have read and own. And the next one chronologically, published, I believe, in 2002, is his most famous work, Devil in the White City. And as you can see, it was a finalist for the National Book Award, and deservedly so. Devil in the White City, as you can see from the background here, is a book set during the 1893 Chicago World Exposition, one of the early World's Fairs. And the book is a dual narrative. It bounces back and forth, chapter by chapter, between the team that was putting together and designing the World's Fair. As I recall, it's been a while since I've read this. The leader of the team was an architect named Olmsted. I think that was his name. Who was a famous architect of the era. He designed the Flatiron Building in Manhattan. Anyway, a prominent architect of the time, and he led the effort to organize and build the World's Fair. And of course, the World's Fair was notable for many things. The ones I can remember off the top of my head. The first Ferris wheel was at the 1893 World's Fair, and it was gigantic. And the idea was they wanted something at the Chicago World's Fair that would rival the Paris Exposition or World's Fair that had occurred just a few years earlier. And and the showpiece of that World's Fair was a little structure you may have heard of called the Eiffel Tower. And the thought was they wanted an architectural marvel to rival the Eiffel Tower, and and the Ferris wheel was their kind of effort in that direction. And the Ferris wheel is named after it's an inventor and its engineer. I forget the guy's first name, but his last name was Ferris. It's a Ferris wheel named after Mr. Ferris. Um, the World's Fair was supposed to have occurred at the what would it have been the 400th anniversary of Columbus's landing in the New World. In fact, it was often called the Columbian Exposition. But it didn't get pulled together in time, and so it wasn't held until 1893, a year late. But other things that occurred at that World's Fair, the first uh, the first presentation of the Pledge of Allegiance was at this World's Fair. And if you polled most people, they would assume that the pledge goes all the way back to the founding of the Republic, but no, it was developed very, very late. I have mixed feelings about the Pledge of Allegiance. I certainly respect it and say it probably as much as most Americans do. But the book gives you some insights into how it was developed, what its purpose was. Um, like I say, to me, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Uh, there were some food innovations that were first introduced to the World's Fair. Um, Aunt Jemima pancake mix was first introduced to the world there. Cracker Jack, the snack food, was first introduced there. Chewing gum, modern chewing gum, first exhibited there. And as you can see, the White City, this is the fairgrounds, and it was illuminated with electrical light, which was a true engineering marvel for the time. The White City is an homage to the White City in Wizard of Oz. If you've only seen the movie, the Emerald City was originally the White City. In the book, it's the White City, and it's illuminated in the real world with electrical light. And that is another interesting part of this story because of the way the contractor was selected to provide the electrical light. One of the early Edison versus Westinghouse um, rivalries over development of electricity in the early days of electricity, and uh, and Tesla and Westinghouse and alternating current won out over Thomas Edison in direct current, AC versus DC, and AC wins. Um, but in any event, other than that, it was like a very grand exposition, and it drew thousands and thousands of tourists. It was one of those pivotal social events of the era, remembered for many years after. But and every other chapter covers that story. But in the alternating chapters, you also hear a darker side of this story. Um, a a con man slash sometimes uh, quack physician who went by the name H. Holmes, who bought a hotel on the edge of the fairgrounds and used that hotel to lure young women into the hotel where he murdered them in very gruesome and disturbing ways. Murder's one thing, but some of the things he did in his like little house of horrors are truly bone chilling. But in any event, the narrative splits between those two stories. You'll get a story about the World's Fair, and you'll get a story about H. Holmes and, the killings. Um, and I've discussed this book with many people who've read it, and I was one of the people who would, try and get through the H. Holmes chapters because I wanted to know what was happening with the World's Fair. But I know plenty of other people who said, "Oh no, another dull World's Fair chapter." What they want to hear more about H. Holmes. And final note for this book: the film rights were sold long ago to Leonardo DiCaprio. He was very interested in doing a film where he would play H. Holmes, and I think that would be an interesting spectacle if it ever develops. In any event, that's his second narrative history. All right. And yes, a very good read. Wholeheartedly recommend it. The next one, 2006, Thunderstruck. This is also a dual narrative, but this one jives better than Devil in the White City. really, in my opinion, when you get to the end of Devil in the White City, you've read two books. You've read a book about a serial killer, and you've read a book about the World's Fair. Um, this book was also a dual narrative, and it tells the story of the development of wireless telegraph, radio, by a guy named Marconi, and it's half his story, and the other half is about a doctor, Dr. Crippen, who had murdered his wife and was on the run. And the intersection of those two stories occurs because he was discovered trying to flee America on a ship, was discovered on that ship, and through the use of wireless telegraph, law enforcement was alerted and he was captured. Um, this one works a little better because those two narratives are eventually woven together. I've not read this one, but I certainly plan on eventually reading this one. Um, I've read four Larson books, and I have no doubt that this one will be same style, hopefully same good prose, and it's basically written the same way. Uh, Plenty of notes in the back if you want to know more about it. Extensive bibliography. It's a work of history, but once again, it's going to read like a novel. All right. Um, Probably his second most popular work. This one was published in 2011. Um, in the Garden of Beasts, Love, Terror, and an American Family in Hitler's Berlin. And this is the story of William E. Dodd, who was a history professor, I believe, from Chicago, who was appointed America's first ambassador to Germany after Hitler took power in 1933. And he went there with his family, who included his adult daughter. Let's see if I call her name. Martha. Martha had recently gotten a divorce, and part of the reason she's there with her younger siblings and her parents in Berlin is to kind of escape the turmoil of that failed marriage. Um, this book has, to my mind, the darkest tone of any of his books, even worse than Devil in the White City, where where half the book is about a serial killer. Um, the atmospherics in this are just dark, and they get darker as time goes on. At the time Ambassador Dodd arrived in Germany, the world didn't really know what to think about Hitler. He had just come into power. There were many who thought of him as a moderating influence, and perhaps a bulwark against communist expansion from the Soviet Union. And at the time, America was very isolationist, and America was not interested in getting into any conflicts, but once again hoped that Hitler might be a stabilizing influence. Of course, we know that didn't occur. Um, but Martha is enamored. The ambassador's daughter is enamored of the city and the style and just like I say, the energy of many young Nazis that she dates. She dated the first head of the Gestapo, the German secret police. Reading through the book, and particularly when you're reading the endnotes, you realize, well, the Nazis tried to use her. They tried to use the influence she had as a socialite to for espionage, to get information. The conclusion in the book is they really didn't get much out of her, because it just wasn't what Martha was about. Martha was about the social scene. But in any event, as the years grow on, as Ambassador Dodd stays on, he realizes more and more how dark things are in Germany. Starts sending telegraphs back home to the State Department, who's, well, frankly, aren't given a lot of seriousness to his warnings. But yeah, he's literally telegraphing that this Hitler guy is going to be a real problem. Things are getting really bad really quick, and we need to prepare for it. Really, really good read. My wife has read both this one and Devil in the White City. She liked both, but I remember when she first read it, she thought this one edged it out. I'm kind of the other way. I like Devil in the White City a little more than this one, but this was a great read. Recommend it to anyone, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Particularly, like I say, if you like history and you're interested in that, particularly if you're interested in the time period, you're going to love this book. Right, where's next? Uh, The last one that I own a physical copy of. Ooh, let's see. I still have. I've not done a good job cleaning this one. But anyway, this was, of course, Deadwake, The Last Crossing of the Lusitania, published in, let me take a look at my notes, 2015. And this is a story of the sinking of the Lusitania, which, if you remember history class, particularly in high school, you were probably told that the sinking of the Lusitania was one of those pivotal events that drew America into the First World War. Uh, Not really. There were many Americans killed in the sinking of the Lusitania, but if you think about the date, the Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Ireland in what, 1915, and it was over 2 years before America finally declares war on Germany. But it's part of a policy that does certainly contributes to the war, and that is unrestricted submarine warfare. And this is the same kind of Erik Larson book. Once again, narrative driven, with really good prose. Some people think his stuff's a little bit slow, but I think it's just because he's being thorough. Um, it's the way, in my opinion. And this is another really good one. You've got what's going on with the Lusitania as it's crossing, and at the same time, you've got a young U-boat commander, Wilhelm Schwieger, I believe. Oh, well, like I say, it's been a bit, but you're in the U-boat with him once again, kind of chapter by chapter. It's not really a split narrative because it's really the same story, but you'll have a chapter about the Lusitania, and its crossing, and you'll have another chapter um, about Commander Schwieger, prowling the Atlantic looking for targets. And of course, he gets really lucky. Um, One still cloudless night, puts a torpedo into just the right spot in the Lusitania, and it sinks in 18 minutes. Um, Very few survivors, thousands die. And part of the reason it went down so quickly was because he hit an area where, as I recall, where where he struck the cargo the Lusitania was carrying, and even though the Lusitania was a grand passenger ship, it was carrying tons and tons of explosives and ammunition for the British war effort. And like I say, just a real human tragedy, but a really, really gripping story. This one I really enjoyed well. Um, if I had to, and this is the fourth one I read, and if I had to rank them, I think I would say first Devil in the White City, in the Garden of Beasts, this one, Deadwake, and then probably Isaac Storm. But all were great reads, and therefore, if I find him, I'm catching him and I'm bringing him in. Let's see. After that, two other nonfiction books that he's written. One that I owned, Splendid in the Vile, which is a biographical sort of work about Winston Churchill's family for the first year he was prime minister. I think from May of 1940? May of 1940 to May of 1941. It's a little slice of his administration. Well, if you've ever seen the film with Gary Oldman playing Winston Churchill, the same sort of time frame. Um, England's darkest hour, and it's the story of Churchill and his family, and particularly a lot of stuff from his daughter Martha. Um, I've not read that one. I had it for quite a while, intending to read it, and when I was trying to repent or do some repentance from being a book dragon, I donated it. I've got it covered up now, but I had at one time like 3 Winston Churchill biographies, and I gave away 2. The one I kept is a more general biography, covering his entire life. And this is just like a little slice. This is literally 1 year of his life. But I have no doubt it's going to be well written and gripping, because Erik Larson has never failed me, and so I would assume this one will be equally compelling. The last nonfiction book he's published, it was just published late last year, and I'm going to get the title right. It's called The Demon of Unrest, a saga of the heartbreak and hubris at the dawn of the Civil War. And it is a book about events leading up to the Civil War and some of the pivotal characters, North and South, that that were prominent in the era and kind of pulled things in the direction they finally went. I've watched a couple of interviews he's had about it. Um, if you get a chance, both YouTube and other sources, Erik Larson is also a very gifted speaker, and he he loves to go on book tours in support of his books, and he's really good at it. Just like I say, a very entertaining speaker. And I've seen a couple of his presentations on his most recent book, The Demon of Unrest. Um, and based on some things he said, I think I really would like it. I've read much of the history of that era, and it seems to me like he has adopted my own personal theory behind the cause of the Civil War, and that is mass hysteria. That by the time you get to the pivotal and climatic event in this book, the firing on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, that it was too late. That on both sides, the fear of the other was just so overwhelming that the war, it was almost inevitable. Uh, and you can tell, I mean, he's a fan of Lincoln. And those of you who've watched my channel long enough know that I am not necessarily. I respect Lincoln. I think he was a consummate politician and a very effective leader. But no, as I've said, and I think I coined this phrase, at least I've never heard anybody else say it, I do not worship at the shrine of St. Lincoln. Once again, I think I respect him. I respect what he was able to do. Um, but no, not a fan. And I think he accurately gets some of Lincoln's failings early on. Um, from the time when Lincoln was elected until maybe like the first few months of his administration. Some missteps that Lincoln made. Now, of course, Lincoln learned very quickly, and like I say, was both militarily and politically a strong pivotal figure who got done what he wanted to get done. Agree or disagree with his means, he was very effective. But I think that, plus, like I said, once again, it's Erik Larson. And I would imagine that it's going to be a best-selling book. I have not looked at figures, but I guarantee you, based on his reputation, he sells plenty of copies. And I'm hopeful that maybe sometime this year, I will start to find copies of the latest book, The Demon of Unrest, out in the wild. And I will get one for myself. And all the rest will probably go to the Hatter. Um, oh, in conclusion, I've several times on this video said that Erik Larson writes history that reads like a novel. He has actually written one novel, his 10th book. Let's see, it's published in 2021 called No One Goes Alone. Odd thing about the book is you're not going to find a physical book copy. All the information I've gathered indicates that it's audiobook only, which is different to say the least. But for whatever reason, he's decided not to publish a physical book. And therefore I've never found Book Hunting because it doesn't really exist as a real book. But who knows? Maybe one day I'll come across it. But yes, and I know nothing about it. No more than the title and the publication date. In fact, I didn't even know about that until I was just doing a little bit of brief research to make sure I didn't miss any of his books that I'm talking about here. But yeah, 10 books. The four I've read, I recommend all of them. And I would probably recommend at least taking a shot to try any of his other books. But anyway, that concludes my thoughts on Erik Larson. If you've read Erik Larson, let me know what was your favorite one. And event. This was obviously not Adventures in Book Hunting. This was Adventures in Reading. But once again, I guess for this one, I should wish you well and have good adventures in reading, but also good hunting. And I will talk to you again soon.